I'll introduce the next talker in English. אפשר בעברית? אתה גם תרצה בעברית? לא. אוקיי, בסדר, אני חשבתי לעשות הומאג'. בכל זאת זה נשמע distinguished professor of history, בתרגום לעברית נשמע היום ונורא. וזה מה שמיכאל ברנר, שמחזיק בקתדרה על שם סימור וליליאן אבנזון, ללימודי ישראל באוניברסיטה האמריקאית בוושינגטון די.סי, שם הוא משמש כמנהל המרכז ללימודי ישראל. הוא גם מחזיק בקתדרה להיסטוריה ותרבות יהודיים באוניברסיטת לודוויג מקסימיליאן במינכן. הוא הנשיא הבינלאומי של מכון לאובק לחקר יהדות גרמניה. ב-2014 הוא ענק לו ה-Order of Merit על ידי הרפובליקה הפדרלית של גרמניה, וב-20 היה הראשון שקיבל את פרס סלו וז'נט ברון למצוינות במחקר היסטורי של הניסיון היהודי. הפרסומים האחרונים שלו הם Hitler's Munich, Jews, the Revolution and the Rise of Nazism ב-22 ו-In Search of Israel, The History of an Idea, 2018. בבקשה.
תודה רבה, ותודה רבה להזמנה. זה באמת כבוד גדול בשבילי להיות פה. אני לא הייתי תלמיד במסגרת של כיתות האוניברסיטה שלך, שולה, אבל את היית מורה שלי בהרבה מסגרות אחרות. אני יכול להגיד שלמדתי באמת ממך איך לחפש לפעמים שאלות, איך לשאול שאלות, ולפעמים גם איך למצוא תשובות. והיום למדתי מושג חדש, אנחנו אחים באמת. אנחנו היינו מנחה ראשי, או עיקרי, ואני שני, של לפחות אחד המארגנות של הכנס הזה. אז אמרנו דוקטור מוטה ודוקטור פאטה, אז אנחנו דוקטור גשוויסטה. אני חושב שאי אפשר לתרגם את זה, אבל אנחנו אחים של דוקטורנט. אני מצטער שאני אדבר באנגלית, אבל זה קצת יותר נוח לי. אני אדבר על January 1933 from a Jewish perspective. Things looked good on New Year's Eve 1932 for Germany's Jews. Berlin's leading newspaper, the Vossische Zeitung, regarded the downfall of Hitlerism, it's a quote, as unstoppable. There was talk of a total crisis of the Nazi movement that befell its head, its limbs, and its voters. That's the quote. Der Zentralverein Deutsche Staatsbürger jüdischen Glaubens, the main organization of German Jews, issued a promising statement, actually quite remarkable. We welcome the new year 1933, which contains twice the lucky number 3, I don't know why it's a lucky number, but the lucky number 3, and we are confident that it will be a year of general upswing for Germany and the world, and also for German Jewry. December 1932. What a prediction this was, at least from hindsight. But to many contemporaries, it resonated when taking into consideration the most recent political developments. In the November elections of 1932, the NSDAP dropped from 37 to 33% of the votes. And for many observers, such as Leopold Schwarzschild, the left liberal editor of the journal Tagebuch, this marked for the first time after a long period a crack in the wall of clouds. that had been gathering on Germany's political sky for some years. The poet and anarchist Erich Mühsam wrote, also December 1932, "They, the Nazis, will never come to power. The German proletariat will not be put down." In her latest book, Professor Schulamit Wólkov undertook to recount German history from a Jewish perspective. That's the German title of the book. She writes that German Jews always looked at the events from a singular perspective. They were sensitized for certain aspects in the society which they lived, namely the ambivalence of the time, and from their perspective, the ambivalence was more extreme and striking than for others. Thus, they often recognized the other face of Germany, and when we follow this perspective, we can better understand German history. In my short remarks, I intend to follow Shula Wólkov's perspective, not from the macro view. Her book traces it from the time of Enlightenment until our own day, but from a micro view and concentrate more or less on 1 month, maybe the most decisive month of German history, January, February 1933. Hans Schäfer was one of Germany's highest-ranking Jewish state officials, and therefore, one should believe, one of Germany's best-informed politicians. As Undersecretary of State in Germany's Department of Finance, he participated in many cabinet meetings. He also kept a meticulous diary. After the 1932 November elections, he wrote, "I believe that we underestimate the loss of the Nazis after November 6. Each loss of the Nazis is the beginning of their end." In his entry of December 29, he trusted Chancellor Schleicher's opinion that we do not have to worry at all. The Reichswehr will not recognize Hitler as Chancellor. And if Hitler uses violence, we can fully trust the Reiter Regiment, the cavalry, in Potsdam, which is on standby. If Schäfer and Schleicher were so clueless that they seriously believed that the cavalry would stop Hitler, how would the less informed German Jews know? Perhaps the most surprising event from today's perspective happened in Berlin's Oranienburger Straße 1 week before Hitler was appointed Chancellor of the German Reich. German state officials, and together with Jewish community leaders, were reunited for the last time in celebrating a major cultural event. On January 24th, 1933, the Berlin Jewish Museum opened its doors with a solemn ceremony. The next day, readers of the Vossische Zeitung learned about a small detail in one of the exhibit's less spectacular objects. As art historian Max Osborn pointed out, there was an ancient Palestinian clay lamp in the museum's collection engraved with both a Star of David and a swastika. "Isn't it charming?" Osborn asked his readers. When on March 2nd, a Prussian government delegation visited the museum, it already appeared much less charming and seemed rather like an epitaph to a bygone chapter of German-Jewish coexistence. Only a few blocks away from the burnt-down Reichstag and a few days before Hitler's final election victory, the head of the visiting delegation, Ministerialdirektor Trendelenburg of the Prussian Department of Culture, and that's the quote from the newspaper, expressed his enthusiasm about the establishment of the museum and its riches of outstanding Jewish artifacts. Berlin, March 2nd, 1932. Leon Feuchtwanger, whose novels were not only bestsellers in Germany, but around the world, celebrated the new year far away from his new elaborate home in Berlin-Grunewald, into which he had just moved a few months earlier. he was on a reading tour through America, where he was received by celebrities from cultural and political life. On January 11th, he dined together with Charlie Chaplin at Albert Einstein's house in Pasadena, where the German Jewish physicist had arrived from Berlin in December and where he was a visiting professor. On January 25th, Eleanor Roosevelt, whose husband had just been elected the 32nd President of the United States, gave a dinner reception for Feuchtwanger in New York City. And where did the author, who scorned the whole Nazi leadership for many years, he already wrote a wonderful book in 1930, a terrifying book about the rise of the Nazi movement, a novel, success, Erfolg. Where did he spend the very day Hitler was appointed? Well, of all places, at a reception that the German ambassador hosted for him in New York City. He noted in his diary, "What an irony that the German ambassador organizes a lunch for me exactly the day that Hitler is appointed chancellor." At the beginning of his American trip, Feuchtwanger had still exclaimed, "Hitler is over." Now, on January 31st, Martha Feuchtwanger told her husband in a telegram, "You have embarrassed yourself pretty badly with your Hitler is over." They both never returned to Germany. Albert Einstein returned only once to German territory, and it was not within Germany's borders. Just hours after his ship from New York landed in Antwerp on March 28, 1933, he entered the German embassy in Brussels to personally return his German passport and renounce his German citizenship. Like Feuchtwanger, he also would never again come back to the country in which he was born and raised. Most German Jews, of course, were no Feuchtwangers or Einsteins. How did they react to Hitler's appointment as chancellor? Many probably thought more or less like Rosa Süß from Mannheim when she wrote to her newlywed daughter Lieselotte, who was just spending her honeymoon in Italy. Today Hitler was made Reichskanzler. Well, they will only cook with water too. We'll have to see and wait what is coming. What was coming was, as we know, not very promising for Germany's Jews. German Jews did not react in a uniform way in these early weeks and months of 1933 to the rise of Hitler to power. The more assimilated ones, for whom their Jewishness had been rather marginal and who felt first and foremost as Germans, were hit hardest, as painter Max Liebermann expressed in a letter to the Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik and to Tel Aviv's mayor Dizengoff. Like a horrible nightmare, Liebermann writes, the abrogation of equal rights weighs upon us all, but especially upon those Jews who, like me, had surrendered themselves to the dream of assimilation. As difficult as it has been for me, I have awakened from the dream that I dreamed my whole life long. While Liebermann woke up from his lifelong dream, others continued to dream. Hans-Joachim Schöps, a young Berlin Jewish youth leader, represented the small group of ultra-nationalist German Jews. He received some attention, or maybe we should say notoriety, with the writings he published just before Hitler came to power. Schöps was as far right as a Jew could be in these days. In 1933, he founded the Vortrupp, a Völkisch organization of young German Jews organized according to the same strictly hierarchical principles as those German youth organizations that would not allow Jews as their members. He demanded, quote, the necessary separation between German and non-German Jews and the gathering of all German-thinking Jews under a unified authoritarian leadership, and also an unequivocal dissociation from East European Jews. His loyalty to Germany remained steadfast in the face of its anti-Semitic policies, as he still wrote in 1934, Even when the fatherland rejects us, we remain ready for Germany. Most well-integrated Jews would not try to appease the German Führer, but they could simply not imagine that the dream of German-Jewish coexistence would turn into a nightmare of violence, expulsion, and ultimately mass murder. After the Reichstag was left a lifeless shell, after German democracy had eliminated itself, after the SA mob organized the boycott of Jewish-owned businesses, after all that, Theodor Wiesengrund, Adorno, was still full of optimism about Germany's political future. In fact, he asked his friend Siegfried Kracauer, who had fled to Paris after the Reichstag stood in flames, to return to Germany. Here it is total calm and order. I believe that the situation will consolidate itself. The Zionists, on the other side of the political spectrum, did not wake up of any dream either. In their case, it was because they had not dreamed the dream of assimilation altogether. They felt they had seen it coming for a long time. In their eyes, the Jews' future was in Palestine anyway. As early as 1896, of course, Theodor Herzl had written in his Jewish State, "In our native lands, where after all we too have lived for centuries, we are decried as aliens. If only we were left in peace, but I think we shall not be left in peace." After Hitler was appointed, the Jüdische Rundschau, the Zionist paper, blamed the liberal Jewish leaders of having closed their eyes to the imminent danger. The attempts of assimilation and self-denial are over. It demanded a Jewish community filled with unbending pride of its own peoplehood. In times of danger, the Zionist paper argued Jews should return to Jewish values and no longer trust their old leaders who preached optimism. The young Zionist Berlin rabbi, Joachim Prinz, recalled exactly this feeling of triumph in the face of danger. For us Zionists, he writes, the great time had come. Theodor Herzl's prediction, which he entered into his diary some 50 years before Hitler had come true. The Zionist movement began to understand its great opportunity. We urged mass immigration to Palestine. Pride and dignity, these were the cornerstones of the Zionist response, and it was represented most forcefully in Robert Welch's iconic article that appeared a few days after the anti-Jewish boycott of April 1st, 1933. Word with pride, the yellow badge. Of course, in 1933, the yellow badge was just meant symbolically, and people could hardly imagine that it would be introduced real 8 years later. Orthodox Jews had their own way of reacting to the events of January 1933. At first, they were simply unwilling to believe that things would change dramatically. Immediately after Hitler's appointment, the Orthodox newspaper, Der Israelit, expressed the hope that Hitler and his supporters will not dare to rip German Jews off their constitutional rights or close them up in ghettos. And even if they wanted, President Hindenburg and the Catholic Center Party would certainly prevent any such act. When things got worse, Orthodox Jews responded in the same vein as they respond to every catastrophe in history. In their view, what happened was a divine punishment for not observing the religious commandments. Therefore, the right thing to do in this moment, in their eyes, was to appeal to the non-observant Jews and return them to the faith, and in turn God would release them from danger. So how did German Jews then react to the rise of Hitler? I think it became clear from these very short remarks that there was no unified response, of course. The liberal Max Liebermann, the German nationalist Hans-Joachim Schoeps, the Zionist Joachim Prinz, the Orthodox Jews, they showed different reactions to the same events. And even after establishing a nationwide umbrella organization, German Jews were not a unified group with one view and one voice. There were socialist and conservative Jews, rich and poor, Orthodox and Reform, Zionist and German nationalist. Sometimes the variety of political opinions was expressed within the same family. In this crucial hour, they did not have one but several perspectives on German history, and they drew several lessons from the events of January 1933, but several Jewish perspectives. Some felt they now needed to strengthen the other Germany, and they stayed put. Others felt that as a reaction to God's punishment, Jews had to turn to religion again. And then there were those who just saw one way out, to leave Germany immediately. In 1933, 37,000 Jews left Germany, approximately 7% of the total Jewish population. Among the early emigrants of 1933 was Otto Rudolf Heinzheimer, a 25-year-old young Berlin lawyer. He visited the opera in April 1933 and detected that there were hardly 1% of Jews in the audience, a striking contrast to only a few weeks before. He wrote in a letter to his future wife that there was no place left for the Jews in the university. And following Hitler's speech on the Tempelhofer Feld in Berlin on May 1st, he attempted to come to a conclusion who he was and what his place in Germany was. He wrote, "What and how much ties you to this place? What and how much do you expect here? Is there really no possibility for a Jew to take part in this thing here? Or if there isn't now, when would it be possible again? Where do you belong?" And he answers himself, "Sometimes it seems to me as if I could neither live nor die." Shortly after that, he left Germany and settled in Palestine. And thanks to this decision, we're able to hold this event today. 9 years later, his daughter, Sholomit, was born. We heard about him already from נילי Cohen. There is a very common view that claims, maybe more about non-academics than among academics, how could German Jews have been so blind? I would argue that the situation was more complex than assuming from hindsight that German Jews should have seen it all coming. Let us not forget that the Jews felt at home in Germany. They often lived in places where their roots reached back further than those of their Christian neighbors. Before they were uprooted by force, Jews were emotionally tied not only to their country, but also to the villages and cities in which they had grown up and lived, to the language they spoke, to the culture they were part of. In the bigger time frame, the longue durée, many had felt a social and economic improvement of their status as compared with previous generations and regarded anti-Semitism as a temporary setback. So let us return at the end once again to the letter which the painter Max Liebermann wrote in 1933. As difficult as it has been for me, I have awakened from the dream that I dreamed my whole life long. Was the life of German Jews before 1933, was it really a dream? And then when do we know when the dream turns into a nightmare? When do we wake up? Should German Jews have woken up on January 30th, when Hitler was appointed chancellor, or on April 1st, when Jewish businesses were boycotted, or on April 7th, when Jewish civil servants were dismissed, or on April 22nd, when Jewish doctors lost their licenses, or perhaps on May 10th, when books of Jewish and anti-Nazi authors were publicly burned, or with the Nuremberg laws in 1935, or with Kristallnacht and November pogroms of 1938. And do we know today what the future will bring? In the United States, is there a moment when we might have to wake up from an American Jewish dream? When a wild mob cries, "Jews will not replace us," and the US president calls them good guys? When 11 people are killed in a synagogue shooting? Or maybe when Jewish students on campuses are threatened? When do we know it is the time? When do we know it is too late? And even here in this country, when is the moment? Is there a moment to wake up from a secular Zionist dream? When religion dominates the political discourse? When the separation of powers is threatened? When racist politicians occupy key positions in the government? And what does it mean to wake up? What are the consequences? With all these questions on our mind in these days, German Jewish history may not be so far removed from our minds. And of course, we should realize as historians, it is easy to give answers, to give different interpretations from hindsight. But in the end, we should think it is all of us living today, all of us, who will determine what our societies will look in the future. Thank you.